I should begin by addressing Your Excellencies, Your Eminences, and by thanking the various leaders of the UN Alliance, of course, Austria, and the city of Vienna. But with your permission, I simply want to address exclusively all of us as fellow participants at the fifth Global Forum of the UN Alliance of Civilizations. 大家早上好. Good morning. I'm very pleased and honored to have this exceptionally rare opportunity to share my personal observation to such an important and significant audience in such an elegant ambiance at such a critical moment in human history. I decided to offer the personal but not private observation rather than reading a prepared text. It is an observation from my heart as well as my mind, but it is intended to be publicly accountable, therefore discussable, debatable, and obviously falsifiable. In short, I would like to offer an idea that is a considered opinion of mine, particularly pertinent to making sense of the intercultural dialogue in our age. I would like to introduce two words: spiritual humanism. By spiritual humanism, I do not mean to suggest an ideology, a doctrine, or a philosophical system, but a vision, a sense of mission, a value orientation, and a life that underscores what may be called the global significance of concrete humanity. I would like to begin with a simple observation that we, this particular generation, may be the very first in the evolution of human species that with our naked eye, with the help, of course, the vision of the astronaut, we can see our globe, our Earth, the blue planet, in its entirety. And we realize that the mineral, soil, plantation, water, and air of this blue planet of ours is all vulnerable. And we immediately associate our life situation, the human condition, the viability of the human species, as a situation in lifeboat. We have a sense of togetherness. We have a sense that we are all integral part of a global village. And unfortunately, we are also critically aware our lifeboat is leaking. It's a complex structure. There are many of us on the upper deck, but there are also people suffering down below. And with this critical awareness, our business is to forge a new pluralistic order, one that preserves stability and cohesion within and among societies, and a rule-based international system amid increasing diversity of cultures, ideologies, and worldviews. I think a historical note is in order. We are all beneficiaries, and I may even add victims, of a global process that first began in the 18th century in France, Germany, and England, the Enlightenment movement, a cultural movement a mentality, and also some scholars like Habermas would say a project that is yet to be completed. And we, not only from the academic point of view, but from the intellectual world at large, characterize this as westernization earlier. Later in the 60s, we coined the idea of modernization. Recently, we used the term globalization. It can very well be considered as the same process with different intensity and complexity. Arguably, the most consequential spiritual, intellectual, and material ideologies in human history may have been this Enlightenment. Capitalism and socialism derive from it. Market economy, democratic polity, civil society, the military-industrial complex, multinational corporations, and modern universities, all with outcomes of this incredibly significant and complex process. More important for us are the values embedded in the Enlightenment, such as rationality. Max Weber, as many of you know, characterizes modernization as rationalization. Therefore, in the modernizing process, experts and managers become increasingly important in shaping and managing our world. But other values such as liberty, equality, due process of law, human rights, particularly human rights, but also the dignity of the individual. In our collective tradition, rather than traditional culture, in our collective tradition, either in terms of traditional cultures, any kind that we see fit, or major religious traditions, this legacy rooms particularly significant. We are, in a way, still very much overwhelmed by Enlightenment thinking. But we know for sure, especially in the last 50 years, there have been negative consequences of this process. It's not rationality in terms of human wisdom, knowing thyself, but it's rationality which is often termed instrumental rationality. It's a knowledge not simply to enhance our self-understanding, but knowledge to conquer. The Faustian drive to conquer the world. A kind of anthropocentrism, the belief that a human alone has all the, not just the will, but power and method to shape the universe. It's male-oriented, as many feminists have pointed out. It puts a lot of emphasis on wealth and power. It's a kind of social Darwinism that eventually leads human competitiveness into imperialism, colonialism, and of course, it's geographically, basically, Euro-centered. And it is, in this sense, some of the most brilliant minds in the West in the last half a century have been thinking critically how not to deconstruct, but how to enrich, to broaden, and to deepen this process, to underscore the positive values I just pointed out, but also to totally overcome some of the negative consequences. Great movements such as feminism, ecological consciousness, more recently communitarianism, the emphasis on religious pluralism, and on cultural diversity. Let's take the example of China. China, broadly defined, culture China has been very much overwhelmed by the Enlightenment. Right now, one of the most powerful forces in shaping China is a kind of scientism, not scientific spirit, a scientism, overwhelmed by a kind of technocracy. And it's developmentalism, it's economism, it's materialism, it's the belief that the market economy that will lead to the enhancement of wealth and power is fiercely competitive. Ever since the Opium War of 1839, China has been traumatized So from 1839 to 1949, in that 110 years, every 10-year period, there was a major rupture, change of Chinese society. After the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, until the reform and opening period of 1979, every 5-year period, there's a major rupture, change in Chinese society. The Korean War, the Great Leap Forward, the disastrous after the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and so forth. Even from 1979 until now, in the 30 or so years, China still went through many, many very serious problems, ruptures. Therefore, a powerful and urgent need for a new cultural identity. My wishful thinking, of course, that the identity will be open, pluralistic, self-reflexive, ecumenical. And China will really have to learn to understand her own history with a view to the future as an integral part of the global community. In a rather blunt, maybe simplistic way, I think China will have to learn how to become, in the European sense, an economic man. The definition of an economic man is a rational animal, acutely aware of his or her self-interest, seeks to maximize his or her profit in a relatively free market adjudicated by law. So such a person embodies what I just outlined, some of the great Enlightenment values. Rationality, of course, including instrumental rationality, equality, human rights, dignity of the individual, freedom, and due process of law. So China will have to learn to be rational by overcoming China's perceived and sometimes felt narrow nationalistic sentiments. China will have to embrace human rights. China has signed all the declarations of human rights since 1948. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And China will have to learn again the importance of equality. The coefficiency problem in China, 4.5, is ranked, unfortunately, number 4, even more serious than the United States. And most of all, China will have to learn the rule of law, not simply rule by law. And yet we know in the 21st century, if China is able to learn all these values, which is painfully difficult to be sure, it is not enough for China to be a flourishing community in the 21st century. As the feminists, the ecologists, the communitarianists, the religious pluralists, and of course people who underscore the importance of cultural diversity have noted, China is confronted with the question of aging, how to deal with youth, how to handle migration, internal migration. We talk about migration in the world, but you see in China for the last 20 years, the internal migrations number to about 200 million. Again, unprecedented in human history. And how to deal with the mass media, how to underscore the importance of the domestic question of identity politics, of religion, how to appreciate religion, how to understand Tibet, Uyghur as an integral part of Chinese culture, and how to develop a sense of trust among the Chinese people. The netizens, people who use the network now in China, are very suspicious of anything the government does. And this, of course, is common knowledge. Whenever there's a conflict between the rich and the poor, the rich is always wrong. When there's a conflict between the official and a simple civilian, the official is always wrong. A conflict between the elite university or a mediocre institution, the mediocre institution is always right. So there's a psychology of suspicion, say cynicism. And of course, China's image abroad also requires a great deal of rethinking to build trust. Not the soft power as a power, but trust as an intrinsic value. And when we look at China, especially my idea of cultural China, not just the People's Republic of China, but also including areas like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Chinese diaspora, and maybe all of us connected with China, neither by birth nor by marriage, but concerned about China in a long-term perspective. All of us are in this together. Chinese civilization, we know as a student of Chinese culture, is noted for three very important distinctive features. It's a learning civilization. It continues to learn. And now, of course, China needs to learn even more intensely, not only from the West in Enlightenment, but learn from India, especially Indian culture, the relations between the intelligentsia to its own culture. Learn from the Islamic countries. Learn from Africa. The African proverb that the earth is not a gift to us by our ancestors, but it is a treasure entrusted to us by numerous generations in the future, and learn from many other countries as well. But China has always been a very tolerant society. Three teachings, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, coexisted for centuries. More recently, 5 religions, including Christianity and Islam. And there's never been, in any sense, a major religious war or conflict. These different worldviews, traditions coexist peacefully, sometimes fruitfully. And in this sense, China is also a dialogical civilization, traditionally, with understanding that dialogue requires not only tolerance, but also the recognition of the otherness of the other. With recognition, the sense of respect. With a sense of respect, the possibility of mutual reference, mutual learning, and even the celebration of difference. Harmony requires difference. A precondition for harmony is difference. Difference is diametrically opposed to diversity. And also, China has been not only a dialogical civilization, a learning civilization, a tolerant civilization, but very ecumenical. Very early on, before the time of Confucius, the idea of tianxia, which means all under heaven. And this idea of humanity actually embodies heaven, earth, and a myriad things. One thinker in the 11th century noted that heaven is my father, earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I finds intimacy in the cosmos. All that fills the universe is my body. All that directs the universe is my human nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. So Earth is not a collection of objects out there. Earth is a communion of subjects, as the great ecologist Thomas Berry has noted. Therefore, this idea of the humanities suggests that in addition to the great enlightenment values we outline, we need to have many more great values for human flourishing. It is not enough simply to have rationality, even communicative rationality. We need to have sympathy, empathy, and compassion as universal ethics. Not enough to have rationality, but we need to have compassion, sympathy, and empathy. Not enough to have freedom, we need to have a sense of justice. Not enough to have legality, we need civility. It is not a good idea for any society to become litigious. A society has to be civil. It's not enough to have rights, we need to have responsibility. The dignity of the individual and the harmonious society coexist. For China to become an economic man, in other words, to learn all the values that just outlined, including, of course, human rights, is not enough. Give you one example, which may be simple, hopefully not simplistic. If we exercise the discourse of human rights, assuming I'm a billionaire, you are homeless, I respect your rights. I respect your ability, your right to express your concern, your freedom of religion, and you respect mine. I have nothing to do with you. I don't have to give you $1 because not in the legal or moral constraint of the human rights discourse, I owe you anything. But in a different kind of mindset, a person who's more powerful, influential, have more access to information and ideas, ought to feel obligated for a much larger human community to survive. So in this sense, human rights without responsibility, without a sense of decency, a sense of compassion, is not good enough. We need to broaden our scope from the legalistic language to the language of the heart as well. And because of the time constraint, I will simply conclude that in a world today when half of humanity is religious and the other half not, among the religionists, by far the most comprehensive and important is the Christian tradition, involving Catholicism, 1.2 billion, Protestantism, and Eastern Orthodox. But one of the fastest growing religions is Islam. And of course, Hinduism is not just in Hindu, but also in the Southeast Asia. And Confucianism is not just in China, but in East Asia, including Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam. And yet in the world today, with the advent of the humans' understanding of our blue planet, all religious traditions will have to develop two languages. They have to be bilingual. In the Christian tradition, there's a specific Christian language, not just Trinity, resurrection, immortality of the soul, God's existence, but all kinds of other very complicated features. In Buddhism, transmigration, karma, dharma, nirvana. The two languages are incommensurable. We need tolerance, we need respect and mutual reference and mutual learning. And yet in the world today, it's not possible to imagine that we wait for the kingdom of God yet to come, we can allow the world that is Caesar's world rather than God's world to pollute. We cannot afford to say we wait for the pure land, the other shore. This world is the red dust. Let the red dust be polluted. We need to be responsible global citizens. And the language of global citizenship is a new language. It's the language of spiritual humanism that needs to be cultivated. And we need to cultivate this language, and the language will help us to understand values, not only the great Enlightenment values of liberty, rationality, due process of law, human rights, dignity of the individual, equality, but also the language of the heart, of the great spiritual traditions, of justice, of compassion, of love, of care, and of course, the idea of harmonious society. And this is the context we need to forge ahead and try to think not only individually, but communally. Thank you.